Hello and welcome to this video on a DevOps project. And this a series of video that we are going to release in next couple of weeks time. We are going to complete a complete we'll have basically a complete end-to-end DevOps project. So we have a application which we are basically going to deploy on the cloud and including all the major DevOps tools, technologies that you look across, we are basically going to look across, use it. Now, before we move on to the actual deployment process, let's try to understand a bit about these applications that we are basically going to have. Now, as far as the application is concerned, this application is basically a microservice based application, as is a Perl project and uses the REST and gRPC APIs there. So what do we mean by microservice based application? For people who don't know what microservices are, well, we had a lot of when we started with an application development processes like 10-15 years back. The idea was to develop the application everything in one go. So we started writing the application everything in one go together. We used to call this as a monolithic application, which means all the front end, back end, all the codes were structured and written down in the same file or in the same project itself. Now the problem, if one of the applications, so for example, let's say you have an authentication logic, if the authentication logic goes bad, your entire application suffers the problem. Then the idea was that we moved to something called as a microservice based application. The whole idea of moving into microservice based application was that we divide the entire applications into smaller services altogether. That was the whole objective. Think about Netflix, right? So Netflix have multiple different services. Like for example, you have an auth service, you have a gaming service, you have a streaming service, you have a probably a movie listing service, and so on and so forth. So even if something goes bad into an auth service, still the other services are there, you know which are still working, right? So your entire application never goes out of the order, but still the other application does serve the purposes. Also, it becomes pretty much easier to manage these kind of services as well. Okay, so that's more about a microservices. Now microservice based application became very popular, and nowadays whatever the application, all the major application that you look across, you name it, and they use a microservice based application. Now the nature of this project that we are going to work around, we are going to call this application is basically a gratitude app. Now we'll talk a bit more about this app. I'll share the GitHub link over the chat as well. Now this app is basically a Perl project. Now what do we mean by a Perl project? Which means our database is basically a PostgreSQL database, right? We use Express as backend, we have a React as frontend, and definitely a Node.js project it is. So this is what this stack is going to look like. And then we have the application consists of both the REST APIs and the gRPC being involved into it. For people who don't know what are the REST APIs and the gRPCs, well, REST APIs are are general APIs that you call across, who uses a resource based method to talk about. Right? It's more about a resource oriented, the REST APIs, resource oriented, which means when you basically request, you request for a resource over an HTTP or HTTPS call. That's basically your REST APIs. Now, on the other hand, when we talk in terms of the gRPC, well, gRPC was something which was created by Google, right? And it's called as the Google, or a lot of places it says as GNU as well. Remote Procedure Call, RPC, right? That's the basically this standard way of communication. So just like the REST APIs, they used request response over the HTTPS. Here they use a RPC based communication to have it. Now the REST APIs, they also kind of use something called as a JSON, right? So that's basically the data format. So over here, the data format is basically a JSON data format. On the other hand, gRPC basically use something called as the protobuffer basically. It's more like a binary, which is compact, right? And then so JSON is more textual, human readable format, but protobuf is basically a binary. It's very compact altogether. Now this because of this, because of the the nature binary, it basically reduces the size as well, and hence the processing time of the gRPC basically reduces. In other words, gRPC is approximately 30%, 30 to 60, 65% faster, than the REST APIs altogether. Now the question comes back, right? If gRPCs are so good, why don't we just have the gRPC all the places? Well, a lot of modern day browser, they don't support gRPC in general. So still, it's a work in progress. They're including the gRPC calls and everything, and they're kind of working around with that. On the other hand, when it comes to the REST APIs, REST is something which is very common, right? So we send a data, we make an API call, we get the data in the the textual format. We can read, we can deduce the data, we can do some operations on top of the data. So REST is more human friendly in that call. So that's basically the whole idea of working with these APIs and the structure. Now looking forward to what our project has to offer, right? We'll move forward and kind of look around with the project as well. Now when you see this project, the project is this gratitude app. So project consists of multiple services all together. Also there are some of the services which actually utilizes an open AI APIs as well. So it does have some generative AI functionality and stuff. So let's talk a bit more about these. Now I've already cloned these application, and I have opened this application on my Visual Code Studio, and we'll talk in terms of the different applications and the different services which are already present here. Let's talk a bit more about them. So if you see, obviously, with this client that you are looking, this is basically React application, right? The front end, you can say. So it's just a front end which is there. Inside the services, you have, 8 different microservices which are running. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, some of the services are basically a gRPC. Some of the services are a REST APIs. So how these things have been, created is that, let's say this is a browser from where, you're going to make a call. So there is like a mostly the services API gateway services are there, like say an API services are there. The call between the browser and the API service in general will use a REST API call. However, there are some other microservices which are not directly exposed to the browser in general, but they will have to communicate between the REST APIs, between the other services altogether. So these microservices and who are communicating with the other microservices altogether, the communication between the two microservices are utilizing a gRPC for that matter, right? So if you look into it, like for example, an API gateway, again a REST API, you have an entry service, right? You have a file service, moves API, move service. So take an example of this moves API. Now this one is more exposed to the browser, right? So there, it's a REST API. However, there's a move service which is doing some sort of the calculations altogether and is basically being called by the moves API. So communication between them is the gRPC based communication channel which is happening around it. So I'll just say more service, right? So this is the nature. And finally, we have to have a PostgreSQL database as well, right? PostgreSQL databases altogether in order to, kind of work around with it. Now, what we are basically going to achieve from this project, right? By the way, we have protos. These are some of the dependencies required for us to work with some of these applications. So we're going to look around when we are basically going to work with it. My question is, what are we basically trying to achieve from this specific project in general, right? Because it becomes extremely important for us to kind of look forward of what are we basically, thinking of achieving from it. What is the end goal? What are we basically trying to achieve? So first of all, our whole objective is that we are going to learn about a bit more on the Docker. We'll do the revision of the Docker concepts so that we basically Dockerize these applications. Then we'll push this application either into the Docker Hub or to ECR. Any of the repositories we can use in order to push it. We'll also refresh our concept around them as well. The third, we'll further go ahead and look around a Kubernetes. We'll write our Kubernetes file. We'll deploy this Kubernetes file, you know, all together. So we'll do all these studies about the Kubernetes. We'll look into the concept of Kubernetes. We'll go across, deploy the files on the Kubernetes, and everything around it. Post that in the Kubernetes by the way, in the Kubernetes we'll also use a EKS cluster to basically deploy our application. Now at this point we'll also go across and we'll look forward to fourth part, which is creating a CI/CD pipeline, right? Where the whole objective would be to, build the application and deploy the application in our, Kubernetes, right? So we'll build a CI/CD pipeline. During the CI/CD pipeline, we are basically going to use GitHub Action for that matter. Okay. Once our pipeline has been done, we are ready that our application is working fine and stuff. Then we'll start building up our structure, like the infrastructure. Like obviously we created the Terra Kubernetes, we'll create the EKS cluster from the command line, but ultimately we would like to put everything on through an IAC. So we'll talk in terms of an IAC, which means through a Terraform. Okay, so create those Terraform structure and everything. Finally, we will work on the monitoring. For this, we'll look around the Prometheus, Grafana, and things around it. We'll create the structure, right? We'll deploy those codes and everything. We'll look forward to it and have it. Now remember, during working with the Kubernetes based application, we are already looking into the GitOps here itself. So all these Argo CD, Helm chart, everything will basically be part of the Kubernetes discussions, are not leaving anything around. So once everything has been done, finally we'll look into the security side of it. So we'll add those scanning processes. We'll basically start refactoring now our all the processes. Look forward to things like we're adding a Trivi or SonarQube and stuff like that, and look forward to those applications on engine. Now remember, this application is a bit longer, entire series is going to be a bit longer. So I'll try to break down these entire series into smaller chunk altogether. Now remember, during the process, if you need any question, anything, feel free to comment out and ask those questions. I'll try to address as many questions as possible altogether. So, let's just start the process altogether. And yes, there are some bonus sections at the end, which I'll go ahead and reveal at the very end altogether. So, without wasting time, let's go to the next video and look forward to the process altogether.